the 55th Annual ISNA Convention. In God we trust.
Assalamu alaikum. I can honestly say that's the best presentation I've ever heard, certainly in the last 10 years, the one you just heard. So you really don't need to respect that. I had the opportunity to go first or second. I chose second. It was a mistake. Okay. What I want to address is very specifically the challenge of religious and political pluralism in America and the world. What's happening in the 21st century? Events today are taking us back. You know, there's a statement, you know, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, etc. We've gone back at least 3 steps. Increased intolerance, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim bias, the rise of white supremacism and nationalism that most of us, at least those of us who've been around for more years than many of you in the audience have probably been around, have actually reversed what we saw as a trajectory. While there may be biological evolution, there certainly is not social or democratic evolution when it comes to looking at America today, and when it comes to looking at Europe, increasingly looking at Europe. For many, obviously, 9/11 was a turning point, but I want to just very briefly tell you about where we've come from, where we were going, and where we are. When I grew up in Brooklyn, I was raised in cosmopolitan New York. But in terms of pluralism, cosmopolitan New York, it was basically an America, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And there was a book that was actually written, and what it was really saying in that book was not just the presence of these 3 faiths at that point, but that finally Catholics were among, you know, it wasn't just Protestants and Jews. Islam was invisible. It's not that there weren't Muslims in America, but invisible in terms of a sense of people noticing and commenting on identity in terms of Islamic centers. But it was invisible in our educational system, it was invisible in our media, and it was invisible in government in terms of training officials who would be analysts. And it was invisible in the main professional associations. The American Academy of Religion, which is the academy in the world for looking at religion, or if you will, the world's religions, in which a few years ago I was honored to be elected president, it did not have a presence of Islam in its programs. There was no Islam section. Now, the reverse is the case today. We have many, many sections on Islam, so that's kind of the good news, that kind of way forward. But the whole point is that in terms of background, there was no background for the movement that we made. Over then the next few decades, Islam became more visible, things were moving forward. In 1993, I was asked to move to Georgetown to create a center called the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. And it's interesting, I was thinking about this on the plane yesterday. The people who initially funded it, which were a group of Arab, Christian, and Muslim businessmen based in the Gulf, were concerned after the fall of the Soviet Union and after Saddam's waging of war and calling it a jihad, that Islam would be seen as the next global threat. But when it was founded, the idea was we would move forward. And indeed, in the early years up to 9/11, there was a tremendous movement and a sense of accomplishment in terms of what the center did, its visibility all over the world, and the kind of attention that we got. But 9/11 put us way back. So that what we wind up with, not only after 9/11, but even more so, I would argue, today, and in the last few years, I think 2015 was like a peak experience, is that you have a situation where far-right ideologues, political parties, media commentators, Islamophobes, and their websites, hardline Zionist Christian religious leaders, can say basically anything about Islam and Muslims. They can say it on the internet, they can be quoted in newspapers, and they can do it with impunity. because a fair number of Americans wind up believing it because they don't know any better, because of the significance, not just of mass media, but in the last 10 years, it's more social media. And with social media, you have, the wonderful thing about it is you have all those sources out there. It's not just as if you have just 2 or 3 newspapers. But with social media, you have to know what it is you're reading, who these people are, what their organizations are. And so when you hear things like American Thinker, Family Security, that sounds nice. Pajama media sounds innocuous. And yet these are powerful sites that often come in under the radar for people who are just going to them, because it's not as if they're called, fight jihad, but rather they have these, what most Americans would see as very, very good, very solid, very sensible things. The role of the presidential elections really proved to be a turning point. In many ways, in terms of American consciousness, I would argue more than the afterflow of 9/11. When Obama ran in 2008 and 2012, the extent to which his, quote, religion was seen as somehow important. I should tell you this, and I'll probably lose my train of thought. The other day I was being taped for a program that may be on PBS in the future. And I used to make, I make a lot of statements when I speak. Some of them are straight and some of them I'm kidding. But the fellow who was interviewing me said, we didn't get that story. That story about, how, and he said, how Obama went on a late night television show and what you said about it. And I kept thinking, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. And then he said, the one where when the host turns to Obama, and I thought, oh my God. I normally would say to people what I hoped for when Obama left office was that the first interview on major television, they'd ask him, how does it feel to be president? And he would begin with, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I thought, wouldn't that really be great? You could just see how apoplectic many people would be. This fellow believed it, and if I hadn't caught that, I would have repeated it on camera, and then I would have had this thing out there of an accusation that I was making. But the presidential elections was stunning, the extent to which Islam became that issue. You remember the case of the youngsters in Dearborn. A picture was going to be taken, and they moved some of the young women with hijab over to the side. You remember that despite a wonderful speech that he gave in Egypt, he did not visit a mosque in America until the last year of his presidency. He was in Egypt, he was in Turkey where I saw and met him, but not in the United States. The extent to which it had gotten to that point was something that, you thought it's not going to go more than this. And then we got the presidential elections, the recent presidential elections of 2016, and we saw Republican candidates, one after the other in those debates, suddenly bringing Islam front and center. Newt Gingrich, Cruz, Carson, and of course President Trump in particular, with his statement about a Muslim ban, with his statement about perhaps monitoring mosques, with his statement in particular that Islam hates us, and the fact that even on successive shows, when asked, do you really mean Islam hates us, or do you mean some Muslims, etc., he gave no really direct answer or response to that. Well, a lot of that was possible because it occurred with 2 phenomena that have really grabbed Americans and helped to form the way they think. One, obviously, is social media, and when it comes to mass media, the significance of Fox, its significance not only in America, but internationally in terms of its viewership. But let me make a few comments about media. And actually, you can find some of this data if you go on the web if you're interested. It's an outfit called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. Media Tenor looked at, this is an outfit that's based in Switzerland and monitors media every day in Europe and America. They have lots and lots of folks who just follow what the headlines are, what's being said about all kinds of topics. And they looked at 975,000 pieces of media, 975,000 pieces of media from 2001 to 2011. And within all that media, the question was, where are Muslims present and Islam, and how do they look? Looking at 2001, they found that 2% of the media emphasized extremism, 0.1% emphasized the vast majority of Muslims and the Muslim world. So 2% versus 0.1%. When they went from 2001 to 2011, they found that the 2% jumped to 25%, but the other side remained exactly the same, 0.1%. An enormous disparity. In a study that occurred in 2015, 2016, they found that looking at media in the US, UK, and Germany, 8 out of 10 stories or coverage were negative. And even those done on mainstream, if you will, mainstream Muslims, 50% or more tended towards the negative side. When individuals were cited in stories, it tended to be terrorists or warlords. And so at that period in time, Media Turner basically talked about the exponential growth of Islamophobia and basically said, as it were, for the foreseeable future, it's here to stay. You combine that with studies done by CARE and the American Center for Progress, which show that more than $205 million have been given to these internet websites and organizations to fund their work and their writing. People like Spencer, people like Pamela Geller and others, those kinds of presenters. In Spencer's case, a number of his books have made the best book, New York Times, in terms of sales. So you have this tremendous amount of resources, 205 million. Where do we see the opposite occurring, the response to this? Where do we see that outside of the Islamophobes? Where do we see that coming out of the Muslim community or out of academia, etc., in any way near up against that kind of set of organizations and that kind of funding, which is beyond belief and beyond beginning to touch? Well, several years ago, we began a project which is called The Bridge, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia. Note the title, because our argument for what we're talking about is to say that if America stands for pluralism and all that we think pluralism, a healthy pluralism, should include, then that's why Islamophobia is wrong. That's why it's possible to say that it's a new form or the new anti-Semitism. We have about 1 million followers now on Facebook. That's tremendous growth. We have at least 5 full-time people working on this. But the reality of it is, again, if you look at, quote, the other side in terms of media and their influence, this is one heck of a, you know, as it were, it's one heck of a battle as one goes back and forth. Why and how do we turn around this situation? And what does that mean? Religious communities today, and all of us, whether religious communities or not, whether religious or not, are challenged to find grounds for cooperation and collaboration within pluralistic societies. And I would argue to redefine pluralism and to redefine tolerance or to throw it out. We can begin with the how and talk about fostering multi-faith relations in the public square. But those relations have to be based on mutual understanding and respect, a religious pluralism that is inclusive, not exclusive, and that acknowledges and embraces religious diversity. That doesn't mean necessarily that one always agrees or accepts someone's doctrine, but that one makes sure that one knows what others believe and that one supports, in the American system, freedom of speech as well as freedom of religion. We need to redefine tolerance, as was pointed out before. Tolerance actually, historically, merely meant coexistence. In the old days, if you were tolerant, it meant, well, I don't advocate in our society that we kill you. But it doesn't mean that I'd want to hire you. It doesn't mean I'd want to work with you. It doesn't mean that I'd want to have you move into my neighborhood. It doesn't mean I'd want to socialize with you. It doesn't even mean that I really respect you. I respect your right to exist, but it doesn't mean that I really feel that I want to interact with you or that I can gain from that. That has to be turned around. We have to be able to basically go for an inclusive definition of tolerance. And I think that's a challenge for many of us. I remember years ago, I was involved with a conference that President Clinton, after he left his presidency, we did something on the Middle East at NYU. And Clinton just came right out and said tolerance was out. Because, in effect, what he was saying is the traditional meaning of tolerance is so value-laden in a negative way, we can't work with it. Well, I think that we have to accept a certain reality, and what we really need to do is to redefine pluralism, and where then, flowing from that, where this broader notion of tolerance will come in. The engagement, most importantly, has to be in the public square and by communities in the public square. When I speak at lots and lots of places over the years, all over the United States and overseas, but particularly in the US, let's say, and certainly where there are a lot of Muslims in audiences, the question will be, well, what do we do and how do we get at this? Well, it's got to be a top-down and a bottom-up approach. It seems to me if we're talking about the public square, it's communities in the public square, it's religious communities, it's social communities, it's neighborhood communities, it's our education system, it's our schools, it's our media. Yes, we should promote interfaith dialogue. I think interfaith dialogue can be important, but we have to go beyond the dialogue of merely, let's say, important religious leaders who sign statements. At the end of the day, that's nice, but they usually get archived. And first of all, they don't get much coverage in the media. Major things like a common word between us and you, a statement that started out with 138 and became 400 major Muslim religious leaders all over the world, basically reaching out in terms of Muslim-Christian relations, and also related to relations with Judaism, but primarily in its initial formulation, and using scriptures to back it up, quoting both the Bible and the Quran, basically wound up having religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders saying, look, we have our differences, but we share a common world, and we share things in common. And we're faced with a really dangerous future, and we need to come together, and we need a basis for what we're going to do. And that basis, really, that we share in common, in our faiths, in one way or another, that part of the basis that's very similar is love of God and love of neighbor. How much media coverage did that get? Why is it when I speak to American audiences, without exaggerating, when I ask people if they've heard about a common word between us and you, I'm lucky if people raise their hand, and maybe 3 to 5. And even when it's a significant Muslim audience. So that media and that media communication becomes very critical, because this is an important set. But it's also important that those religious leaders, and too often that it doesn't happen, the Morocco statement is the more recent one, religious leaders need to follow through. It's not enough that they get together, make a statement, sign it, and then everybody walks away and they go back to business as usual. It's that our religious leaders need to, in the seminaries and the madrasas, etc., where they train the next group of priests, rabbis, imams, they need to make sure that there is an education in terms of the faiths that are existing and interacting with each other. We need religious leaders that not only know their faith, know other faiths, can dialogue, appreciate what's shared in common, and can emphasize and teach that importance in a world in which we can't count on the media to be doing that much for it, and we certainly can't count on our presidential candidates. If we look at the current Trump administration, it's astonishing how many people in the Trump administration, from the president on down, or people surrounding him, their take on Islam. So you have the president saying Islam hates us, okay, and those policies that follow it, but also some of his early appointees, General Flynn, who then had to leave, who was a close association with the organization Act for America, even on their board, I believe. Steve Bannon, one of Trump's major writers, including the fellow who at least gets credit, quote, credit, for working on the speech of the Muslim ban and also the issue on immigration. Miller, who has a long track record before coming into the administration of being very anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. And other people who are advisors who basically have a similar kind of background. The Secretary of State, just a short time ago, after he became Secretary of State, and he's a very bright and talented person, but when it comes to Islam and Muslims, his understanding of it could be seen in a testimonial that came from Act for America. He had been to their organization before, and he went again to receive an award from Act for America. So our challenge as we move forward is formidable. Now, just as Muslims need to better understand other faiths, Christians and Jews and their secular counterparts need to A, know and understand the diversity of Islam, need to become more aware of the faith of Islam, not just the act of extremists, need to display a self-criticism that recognizes that all religions have a transcendent and a dark side. So let me be really clear on that. All religions historically have a transcendent and a dark side. The transcendent side is they believe in a transcendent reality, which for many of us within the Abrahamic traditions, we would say is God. But they also believe the transcendent dimension is that belief and our following that belief helps us to transcend our baser natures, to be better people. But the other side of religion is the dark side. We've had religious fanatics and extremists and warriors from the very beginning, as it were, of religious time. Those aspects have to be there. And therefore, when faiths engage each other, it's that faiths engage each other in terms of the shared principles and values, not the way a lot of people still like to get into a dialogue, which is I talk about my ideal, my faith, the ideal, and then I point to your realities, your negative realities. And then you get into this like tit for tat, back and forth. And what about the role of media? Media needs to say what's going on. Media needs to continue to tell us about the dark side. We need that news. But media needs to frame more and more, to frame it within the broader context of who Muslims really are, whether overseas or within the US and in Europe. Things have gotten better. There's some, better programming, and there's some good programming coming along. But again, if you actually were to look quantitatively at the coverage, it just isn't there. And part of that is understandable, because in our society, if you're talking about anything in our society in America, it's the bottom line that counts in terms of the survival of companies and of media. And everyone knows, in the world in which we function, if it bleeds, it leads. You watch the news reports, and what do they lead off with? When I moved to Boston, I was raised in Brooklyn. My parents lived in Brooklyn. My mother came, first morning, she immediately said, "You really don't want to stay here." And I said, "Why, Mom?" She said, "I just put the news on." And the local news starts in the morning by talking about who's been killed and what's gone wrong. When I moved to Washington, it got worse. Although Washington's gotten better. This is not a knock at Washington. But my mom reacted again in the same way because of that kind of framing. We ran a program where Muslims in the audience asked a number of very top media people, this was at Georgetown, why don't you have more coverage of the mainstream? And the person that answered it said, what our media and our audience want is conflict and conflict discourse and debate. And we see that, whether we look at MSNBC or we look at Fox. Yes, it was important to have common word, But the fact is, why is it that this disappears? One needs to go back and take a look at that. For those of you that haven't, it's really pretty impressive in terms of the way in which scriptures are used and put forward. In an age of globalization and increased religious and ethnic diversity, which is just going to continue to increase, we need a religious pluralism founded in a deep and mutual understanding and respect, one that will truly meet the needs of a new century. Without that, we will see things get worse. If you look at Europe, some of the countries, I've been involved in programs that deal with Hungary and Poland. I remember in one conference, a Polish scholar got up and said, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we don't have many Muslims. The bad news is Islamophobia is very strong in Poland. And if you look at Hungary and Czechoslovakia and recent elections, if you look at Australia, and certainly again, if you look at the tempo and the mood in our country, it seems to me that America in the 21st century and increasingly Europe is and will continue to be extraordinarily multi-ethnic and multi-faith societies. People panic in Europe and America when somebody projects and says there's going to be a browning of the population. They're looking at new Swedish elections, and in an area where you don't have many Muslims, a party has arisen and become a strong force because of its Islamophobic rhetoric. People of faith and of no faith are challenged to work together to build a society based upon mutual understanding and respect, to embrace a healthy and inclusive pluralism, not an exclusivist sense. As long as I say that my faith is perfect and your faith is imperfect, and I don't acknowledge that there are shared principles, values, beliefs, etc., but I give this kind of almost black and white approach to reality, we can't move forward. We can't have a healthy pluralism. Pluralism, politically and religiously, means inclusiveness, not exclusiveness. A tolerance not just of coexistence, but a tolerance that affirms and protects the centrality of our principles and values, equality of citizenship, freedoms, and civil liberties for all. I close with these words of Archbishop Tutu. It is my conviction, and if you forget what it is, just email me, and when you get an answer, you'll see I have it at the bottom of all my emails. It is my conviction that if we are neutral in situations of injustice, note, if we are neutral in situations of injustice, we have chosen the side of the oppressor. The world must learn about respect, listening, and forgiveness. Thank you.
The 55th Annual ISNA Convention. In God we trust.